Alrighty, this is Chapter 13, Developmental Life Course Perspectives of Criminality for Introduction to Criminology. So in this chapter, we're going to look at how developmental or life course theories differ from some of the other ones we've already discussed. We're going to look at certain concepts and factors that are important for these theories, look at some of the criticisms and weaknesses, and identify which theories in the genre seem to best account for certain transitions or trajectories away from crime. And then we're going to look at, as we always do, some of the policy implications right at the end. Okay, so starting off, some of the basic concepts in early developmental theory. So developmental theories are distinguished by their emphasis on the evolution of an individual's criminality over time. So because they're looking at the individual itself becomes the unit of analysis. So the models focus on aspects related to an individual, such as what was the onset of their criminality, what is the frequency or the intensity or the persistence or duration of their criminality. What is the desistance, right? As in, do they stop committing crimes? And, what factors are related to that? And other aspects of an individual's criminal career. So the onset of offending is when the offender first begins offending. And of course, desistance is when they stop committing crimes. So early onset is one of the most important predictors of any of the measures that we have in determining who's most at risk for developing serious violent offending behaviors. So frequency in this model refers to how often an individual offends at certain times, whereas intensity is the degree of seriousness of the offense that they commit. Perhaps the most discussed and research aspect of developmental theory is what's called offender frequency, or it's often referred to in research as lambda. And so estimates of this vary greatly. Some estimates of lambda are in the high single digits, and some are in the triple digits. So the frequency of offending, even within a crime, really varies wildly. So this is why it's difficult, because you're looking at individuals and they can differ in many ways, and that can impact that kind of averaging of their experiences. Okay, persistence or duration is, again, just the length of an individual's criminal career from the time of onset to their final offense. And persistence or duration of offending has become one of the most researched components of this particular perspective. So virtually all studies on life course developmental perspective show that most people who are arrested are never arrested again. However, for those who offend many times, certain patterns start to emerge. And these patterns involve an escalation from minor status offending, usually things like when you're a preteen or a teenager, to higher level petty crimes, and then on to far more serious criminal activity. Right? So it could go from being a preteen and ditching school, or maybe vandalism or something like that, to teenage years. It becomes higher level petty crimes, theft or things like that, and then it moves on to more serious criminal activity. Although the trend is undisputed, other issues are not resolved under the theory. So studies have not yet determined when police contact or an arrest becomes early onset. So most empirical studies draw the line at 14. So that any arrest or contact prior to 14 is considered early onset. But some experts argue the line should be drawn earlier, at age 12, while others argue it should be later, at age 16. So where we draw the line on that stuff is hotly debated. Developmental life course perspective has become one of the most dominant theories in explaining criminality. So it's one of those things that it's really important to understand the concepts and the perspective of. Okay, so one of the specific ones under this banner is anti-developmental theory, or low self-control theory. Developed in 1990 by Travis Hershey and Michael Gottfredson, they proposed a general theory of low self-control as the primary cause of all crime and deviance, sometimes referred to as the general theory of crime. So this theory has led to a significant amount of debate and research in the field, more so than any other contemporary theory of crime. So the general theory of crime assumes that self-control must be established by age 10, and if it hasn't been, that people will forever exhibit low self-control. So this assumption of the formation of low self-control by age 10 or before is the oppositional feature of the theory to the developmental perspective. meaning developmental theory assumes people can actually change, right? That it's not just set in stone at 10 years old. But the general theory, is really coming from a perspective of, or at least from Hershey and Gottfredson, they're saying that you need to have some sort of form of self-control established by age 10, largely as a kind of developmental period of growth. And, not having that means it's going to be difficult to develop. So again, the general theory just assumes that people take control over their own decisions and control themselves, right? So it is accepted as one of the most valid theories of crime. And it's kind of the simplicity of it, right? The idea that why does someone commit crime? Because they aren't controlling themselves enough. They aren't, they don't have the discipline to, basically hold themselves back from committing crimes, right? The idea is that all of us are tempted to do things that go against the way we've been socialized. And so, if you have low self-control, you might be tempted to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. So even though it's considered an anti-developmental theory, it actually does have a developmental aspect to it. The idea that you have to be socialized well enough to develop self-control by age 10. So in contrast to Gottfredson and Hershey's model, another sound theoretical model shows that individuals can change their life trajectories in terms of crime, which we'll talk about in a moment. So research shows that events or realizations can occur to people to alter their frequency or incidence of offending, sometimes to zero, right? So that's kind of a good transition into Sampson and Lobb's developmental model. So they're one of the best known and also researched developmental theory models to date. And so basically what they're kind of doing is reanalyzing stuff from Sheldon and Gluck from the 40s and into a kind of more modern sense. So, they look at it as a developmental model, as a kind of prototype where individual stability and change are the primary focus that they're looking at of their theoretical perspective. So they emphasize the importance of certain events or life changes which can alter an individual's decision to commit or not commit crimes. So the theory is based on social control framework, but it contains elements of other theoretical perspectives. So early antisocial tendencies among individuals, regardless of, their specific identities, are often linked to later adult criminal offending. So some social structural factors like family structure, poverty, can also tend to lead to problems in social and educational development, which then can lead to crime. Another factor is the development of criminality in the influence of delinquent peers or siblings, which then further increases in an individual's likelihood for delinquency. So Sampson and Lobb strongly emphasize the importance of transitions or specific events that are important in altering long-term trends of behavior, which are referred to as trajectories. So a transition could be something like, let's say you get a really good job, right? Then that might, stop you from committing crimes because you don't want to lose that job, right? Or the book example they talk about, marriage can be one of those transitions. Remember how common criminality really is for young adults, right? Like a good 14 to 25 kind of range. And then you get past 25 and crime rates tend to drop off, right? So, as the other model would say, well, it's because they develop some sort of self-control. And there is some backing to that in the fact, especially the frontal lobe fully develops by the time you hit 25. You start thinking a bit more about, the future and the consequences of stuff than you did before that. Yet, Sampson and Lobb are really saying that it's also that you have more to lose, right? So think about it. If you are an 18-year-old out there committing crimes, you're not like, oh no, they're going to take my house, because you don't have a house. Oh no, my wife might leave me, because you don't have a wife, right? Probably. But, or like, oh, my career, because you haven't really had a chance to get that going yet. So the idea is that you kind of have less to lose, which makes you a little bit more of a, liable to commit crimes, right? Because there's kind of less to guard against you doing it, right? So Sampson and Lobb are saying certain transitions, again, stable employment or marriage or things like that, graduating college so that you then have, more legitimate work opportunities could affect what people end up doing or their trajectories. So the trajectories, are really the longitudinal patterns of behavior either toward or away from committing crimes. And it's typically the cumulative result of certain or many specific transitions, right? So again, did you have kids? Did you go into the military? Did you, get a bunch of face tattoos, right? Those kind of things are going to lead to certain trajectories. So there's a lot of evidence to kind of support this, that sometimes individuals who are on a path towards consistent forms of behavior, in this case serious violent crimes, can suddenly or gradually halt them due to transitions or series of transitions. And it can be something like, let's say, loss of a loved one or something like that might change someone's perspective about it, right? So anyway, it's complicated because individuals are complicated. But it is, what you need to know for this class really is more just the issue of transitions and trajectories. Okay, moving on to Moffat's developmental taxonomy. This is developed in 1993, and Moffat's framework distinguishes two types of offenders: the adolescence limited offender and the life course persistent offender. So according to Moffat, adolescent limited offenders make up most of the general public and include all people who committed crimes when they were teenagers or young adults. And this offending is largely caused by association with peers and a desire to engage in activities that were exhibited by adults that they were trying to be, right? So for example, drinking before you're 21, right? Something like that, speeding on the freeway. The idea that a lot of people drink before the legal age of they're allowed to, right? Or a lot of people go past those speed limits, those kind of things. And again, when you're a young adult and you have peer associations that lead you down that path and you want to be cool, it's kind of that peer pressure aspect of you might, engage in certain behaviors, to gain that favorability. And then life course persistent is really, according to Moffat, a pretty small group, about 4 to 8% of offenders. But these are the most violent and chronic offenders. So in his argument, the life course persistent offenders commit the vast majority of serious violent offenses, such as murder, rape, and armed robbery. So for instance, if you think about it, I think rape is a good example because we talk about how 1 in 3 women, statistically, will face sexual assault in her lifetime in American society. But we know that that's what's documented cases, and we know that something like rape is a, particularly underreported crime, right? So some estimates, especially when using self-reported surveys, look at it as more about 2/3 of women in American society. So if you think about that, does that mean 1/3 or maybe 2/3 of men are committing rapes? No, of course not. It's nowhere near that number. So under Moffat's taxonomy, he would say, no, that's just a small percentage of people that are chronically offending, right? So think about your Bill Cosbys, your Sandusky's, your Harvey Weinsteins, your, all of these kind of serial predators that, or, your R. Kellys, these people that we know about that got away with their crimes, sometimes for decades, harming person after person after person, right? So that's kind of one example of that, where when you look at the statistics, it can lead you to an assumption that, oh, there's so many men committing these crimes. But in actuality, there's a small percentage of people doing this. But the other side note is there's a lot of people that cover that up, right? So for every Weinstein, there's a whole staff of people who know that he's assaulting people, who are helping him pay them off, who are even like lawyers that are getting people to sign non-disclosure agreements and all sorts of horrible stuff, right? That doesn't really apply to the theory, but just side note, we should do something about that in society. Okay, so anyway, going back to Moffat, he says that the disposition of life course persistent offenders is caused by an interaction between neurological problems that they have and the disadvantage or criminological environments in which they're living. So he's not saying it's nature or nurture, it's both. And it's really about the kind of criminality of the environment and the brain chemistry of the person. So he says that life course persistent offenders begin offending very early in life and continue to commit, far into adulthood or even middle age, whereas adolescent limited offenders tend to engage in criminal activity only during their teenage and young adult years. Okay, let's move on to Thornberry's interaction model of offending. So this is presented by Terence Thornberry in 1987, and this model incorporates empirical evidence which addressed an extremely important aspect that had never been addressed previously in criminological theory, which is certain factors, such as peer associations, that can be both a predictor variable, but also a factor that's subsequently influenced by other factors that followed it temporally, such as offending. Okay, that sounds really confusing. So basically what that means is negative peer influences predict future offending, but that offending can then create even more negative peer influences, thus leading to more criminality, right? So you have some bad kid friends, they get you in with a group of people that are bad, but then you commit crimes with those people and you just get deeper into that group, which then motivates you even more, right? So he sees it in that kind of almost like a model in which it continues in a feedback process, sort of loop, right? So he's really combining social control and social learning models in how they understand people's criminal behavior. Thornberry's interaction model incorporates 5 primary theoretical constructs, which are synthesized in a comprehensive framework to explain criminal behavior. So the 5 concepts include commitment to school, attachment to parents, belief in conventional values, and all of that's coming from social control and bonding theories. And then the last 2, adoption of delinquent values and association with delinquent peers, these are drawn from social learning and differential reinforcement theories. So think about it. This is kind of what leads you to either commit crime or not commit crime, right? If you're committed to school, you have attachment to parents and belief in conventional values. Those things are going to guard against you committing crimes. But if you adopt delinquent values and associate with delinquent peers, that's going to push you towards committing crimes. So these 5 constructs are really interesting in the way that they relate to each other, and it has added some understanding of criminal behavior to the kind of body of literature. So he's really, again, that feedback loop is what's so interesting that he's kind of adding to the analysis. So he's arguing that engaging in crime, again, leads to hanging out with more delinquents, and hanging out with delinquents leads to committing more crime, right? That's the circle. So he says that, the social bonding, the social control aspects are really important. So having a good connection to school, having a good connection to family dynamics and parents, belief in conventional values, so being appropriately socialized to value the kind of normative stuff in society, that those things are going to have a lasting impact on your moral beliefs, which are going to obviously steer you away from criminal offending, right? But if you have a lack of moral beliefs, if you then are adopting more delinquent values, that's going to push you towards, or maybe you have like attachment issues, or, you have a family structure problems, so you're not like getting the kind of love and acceptance you need at home. This is kind of what undergirds a lot of the issues about gangs, is the idea that if people are, let's say, commitment to school, well, what if you're growing up in a very poor neighborhood where the school is just warehousing you, right? Meaning the school's very underfunded. It's basically, very school to prison pipeline setup, where if you get in trouble at school, it ends up becoming a juvenile justice issue. So you see that, school doesn't really offer you a lot of legitimate opportunities in society. You don't have a clear attachment to parents because maybe there's some issue with them. Maybe they themselves have engaged in criminality. Maybe there's a lot of family disruption in the family that leads to a lack of stability. Potentially, if a parent, maybe potentially if they're incarcerated, they're just not physically there, that can cause some issues. Not just like emotionally, socially, but also of course financially, right? That just makes life a lot harder when you don't have the financial support. And of course, any of the ways in which parents, again, are just maybe violent or maltreating or abusing their children, that's going to lead to a rejection of the value system that those parents are trying to promote, or a rejection of connection to that particular kind of socializing agent in society. So that's obviously going to rock your belief system in conventional values. So it's really interesting how this connects to, well, what do we do about it? Well, if this is empirically supported, which it is, then what does that show us? It shows us that we really need to find ways to help families, right? Like I teach a class called Family Violence, and we talk about, some of the goals in Child Protective Services is really about keeping families together, even if they're going through issues, largely because when kids enter the system, there's all sorts of other consequences that they may experience, right? And so oftentimes the number one goal is really reforming the issues that are present and making sure that families can actually, go through those issues, whether it's, cognitive behavioral therapy, anger management, or any sort of other interventions. So I think it can't be undersold, really, though, commitment to school as another way of how this works. It's a major agent of socialization for us. And think about it. When you're a little kid and school is fun and you have a positive interaction with school, you want to keep doing it. It's why they've basically shown support in longitudinal studies that kids that use the Head Start program, so Head Start, if you don't know, it's one of those programs that they basically offer for low-income families for their kids to basically have like a preschool experience where they, they're kind of taught literacy and sharing and a lot of the kind of socializing factors that make them just more successful when they get into school, so they're ready for school. And what we find is that when kids are ready for school, they have a much better time of it, right? They see school as a positive outlet and not an enemy or something, a challenge to be overcome. So they see it as a positive factor. And the more that kids are connected to it, the better they do, the more that it becomes a socializing agent against negative stuff, right? So what's interesting is a program like Head Start, it has been shown, through longitudinal studies, that kids who complete Head Start at 3 or 4 years old are more likely to graduate college than their peers that did not, right? So why would you going into a preschool at 4 affect you going to college or not? Well, part of it is that investment and connection to school, right? And if it's something like you have connection and commitment to it, then it's going to be something that pushes back against the ideas of offending, or if you have those choices or opportunities to, you might not, because you don't want to risk that kind of support and network that's been built through that particular institution. Okay, so what are some of the policy implications? Well, the first is that, prenatal and perinatal stages of development are really important, and interventions need to take place during that time. So if policymakers want to reduce early risk factors for criminality, they should insist on universal health care, right? Well, in the chapter they talk about universal health care for pregnant women, but let's be real, it's not like health care ends as soon as you're out of the womb, right? There's basically every other developed nation that exists in the world has some form of socialized or universal health care so that people can access the care they need without going bankrupt. Right? So think about it. If prenatal and perinatal stages are really important, then we need to make sure everyone has the resources they need to have successful, healthy pregnancies. So that's huge. But again, it's such a weird thing in the wealthiest country in the history of the world for universal healthcare to be controversial when it's something that, came to Europe, generations ago. But it's because of if you look at it in a sociological way, it's really this kind of emphasis on individuality that we have and hyper capitalism that we have that says, well, if I can pay for me, why should I pay for you? Versus the ideology in a lot of these other cultures is, if you have more, then you should be able to offer more so that everyone can get the care that they need, which makes for a healthier society. So thinking about it within the context of crime, putting a little money on the front end to give people health care could actually save us a lot of money on the back end of not putting people through the court system, through criminal system, locking them up or incarcerating them for generations. So anyway, but that often is not factored in when the politics happens, right? Anyway, another big one is exposure to lead or other toxins should be monitored. So if we know that low self-control is a big issue, we know that things like lead poisoning lead to brain development disorders, or basically just completely eradicate parts of the brain that can never be fixed. And some toxins like lead are cumulative, right? So it's not like you were exposed to it once, you're exposed to a little bit of it over time, every day, in the drinking water, in the shower. I'm sure if you've heard about lead, you think of, Flint, Michigan, and the way that their unelected city manager decided to save a couple dollars by using the polluted Flint River instead of the previous reservoir system they were using. And what happened was the polluted water from the Flint River, when it was running through people's pipes into their homes, stripped the lead out of the pipes and caused this horrible crisis. And to this day, there's still not, this is not fully solved within Flint, Michigan. For a couple of years there, people were showing up with water bottles and thinking they were going to intervene, but it still has not really actually been fixed. So again, that's another example of how the short-sighted idea of cutting costs actually ends up creating billions of dollars in damages, let alone the fact that you now have so many children who are permanently mentally disabled because they were exposed to those toxins and chemicals. So this is a huge one, right? In a country that supposedly has an EPA, right? But it has no teeth in the way that it often can't actually enforce those laws. And then another one is to offer special caseworkers for high-risk pregnancies to, again, just make sure that resources are available to people that need them, so that, because the health and vitality of their children is important, not just for them, but for all of us. That's kind of the ideology that needs to shift. And then the last one is that universal preschool should be funded and provided to all young children, because studies have shown that this leads to better performance once they enter school, both academically and socially. So just like what I was talking about with Head Start program, right? California is one of those ones. They've instituted universal pre-K, which is huge, right? Getting kids into school even like about a year earlier. And that makes it free for parents because the cost of childcare in this country is astronomical. So it's very, very difficult for poor families to be able to afford to send their kids to some of these places that would cultivate their readiness for school. So having universal preschool is huge. And again, wealthiest country in the history of the world. All we'd have to do is take like 1% of the military budget and we could fund healthcare and universal preschool throughout, all 50 states. But unfortunately, again, it's a political thing, and it really kind of comes down to this idea that some people don't deserve it, other people do, and other people don't. And that's really a social ideology that justifies us basically harming children, or at least not alleviating children from harm because of our ideologies, right? Well, why didn't those kids just work harder? Then they wouldn't have been born into a neighborhood with lead pipes. Or why didn't those kids just, work harder? You see this, like there's all these people trying to get rid of school lunches or school breakfast programs that provide free food to kids in school, largely because, some political, why should my money go to these people kind of thing. And oftentimes those things are racial dog whistles. But anyway, it is just such a sad indictment in a culture like ours to say, no, we have all this money, but poor kids should just not eat if their parents don't make enough money. They should suffer as a result. And you think about, how does that then engender kind of delinquency within a child when the school doesn't care about them, when people notice that they're starving and they don't care? That's not going to foster non-criminality. Let me just say it that way, right? So if you do want to create a society that's more equitable, that's going to be a society that has less crime. So that's, kind of part of the policy implications suggested by the chapter.